Your painting skills can be as good as you want. If you don't remove voxel lines and support marks from your resin prints, your paint job will always be overshadowed by those print imperfections. In this video, I show you the tools and methods that I use to get rid of them, how I fix gaps and holes, and how I recreate textures to have a perfect canvas for the paint job. For the first step, which is getting rid of the layer lines and support marks, I use files in different shapes and sizes, sandpaper and sanding sponges like these from Green Stuff, a rotary tool to mill away larger amounts of resin, a scalpel to cut away support marks, and nippers to rip supports out of the model. If you need to put holes into your model after printing, I learned from bad experience, only use an electric drill for very small holes. For everything else, carve them out with a rotary tool. Just make sure to have a good ventilation when you use a rotary tool and create resin dust. I always take my vacuum hose right next to the spot I'm sanding at and a proper mask. I'm always wearing a 3M respirator with a filter for organic fumes and an R3 rated filter against particles. So let's start getting this thing as smooth as a baby's bottom. To maximally reduce the dust flying around in my workshop, I always wet sand with a bucket of water, and you will later see how much dirt accumulates in there over time. I start by dipping the part in water and sanding with the small files. Those files come in different shapes, so you can always take the one that fits best for your current need. At this panel line where support tips are baked onto the model, I choose a file that is just as narrow as the panel line and sand the tips away. After just a few minutes of sanding, it's already pretty smooth. For parts that can't be seen later, I also use wood files to remove material faster, for example when keys don't fit together. And I also use a scalpel to cut away support marks. But you gotta be careful here because you can also rip out too much material when you try to cut, so sanding is the safer method. With nippers, I usually try to pull out all of the supports that are inside the model. The files create a surface that is too rough for priming, so the last step is to take an 800 grit sandpaper. And then that's it, we could now prime and paint this part. All support marks and voxel lines are gone. Unfortunately, our models often need to be printed in multiple parts and then be glued together. A lot of times sanding away the support marks is not enough. Parts often come out slightly distorted after printing, which can create uneven or big gaps between the parts, so we take care of that in a minute. One important decision before painting is if you glue the parts together or if you want to paint them separately and glue them together afterwards, or connect the parts with magnets. I already have a video that shows you how you can create pockets for magnets before printing that you can find in the info box. I usually glue together smaller statues where magnets wouldn't fit, for example for 6 scale figures. And for quarter scale figures, I usually work with magnets and painting the parts separately. But it also depends on the pose and how well parts can be separated in general for the model. Now for gluing, I mostly take 5-minute epoxy. You can mix it with an equal amount of epoxy and hardener, mix it, apply it, and after 5 minutes it's cured well enough to hold your parts together. Until those 5 minutes are over, I use crepe tape to hold the parts in place. For small or very light parts, I also use super glue, but only in combination with an accelerator spray. Otherwise, the super glue takes way too long to cure. With the accelerator spray, it literally takes 5 seconds. The only other glue I would consider using additionally to those two would be hot glue, if I think that I might need to get parts apart at some time. But then you can also use magnets. But it doesn't matter if you glue the parts together directly, later, or not at all. We need to get rid of gaps between the different parts and holes that you might have from the supports, or drainage holes you want to cover up. So let's fix that next. And these are the products I'm using during this step. For large gaps, holes, or spots where I need to remodel texture, I use Milliput or Aves Epoxy Sculpt. For the next level, so smaller gaps, scratches, or holes, I use wood filler or different putties. And for the final steps, I sometimes use spray filler. What I don't use at all is the UV resin I print with. I just want to keep this stuff away from my workbench where I paint at. The resin is simply not designed for this job, so why use it? And when people are even thickening up resin with baby powder, I would bet there is only a tiny layer cured on the outside, and on the inside there is an uncured resin goo forever. Even if you just use it in a thin layer, there's still the problem of oxygen inhabitation, which is a sticky uncured layer that can never be fully cured and would need to be washed away with alcohol after curing. Now let's quickly run through the different products and the pros and cons I think they have. Milliput is pretty common in Europe since it's a UK-based brand. You take an equal amount of both compounds and then knead it until it's a homogeneous mass. It's pretty soft and sticky, so I usually only take it to fill bigger gaps or holes where I don't need to recreate a shape or texture. You can smooth it with water and it dries relatively quickly in about 3 to 4 hours, and then you can sand it. Nowadays I more often use Aves Epoxy Sculpt that you activate just the same as Milliput, but it's less sticky and it's firmer, which means it's easier to use it if you need to create textures or structures. For that I use these clay sculpting tools. But it does take longer to cure than Milliput, and you should not use a lot of water to smoothen it. I had the problem in the past that it was crumbly after curing. What works for me is to take alcohol instead. For the smaller gaps or holes I occasionally use wood filler, although I tend to use it more for the FDM post-processing. I'll post a video for that in the future as well, so make sure to hit the subscribe button if you don't want to miss it. Wood filler has the advantage that it is relatively cheap and it doesn't have any odor. The only problem I see with wood filler is that it can become soft again when sanded with too much water. So rather do dry sanding here, again with proper ventilation and a mask. Tamiya putty is also something I use a lot, but it shrinks while drying, so if you don't overfill a hole or gap after drying, there is still a hole or gap, and it's relatively expensive. That's why I switched to a different brand of one component putty, where a 100 grams tube costs the same as a 30 gram Tamiya tube. What's also quite popular is Vallejo plastic putty. I basically post-processed a whole FDM printed statue with this stuff. If you don't have watched that, go check the link in the info box and watch it after this video. The reason I don't use it anymore is it dries with a weird soft texture that is not great to sand. You can easily rip out larger pieces while sanding. And last but not least, there is two component putty, which I don't use anymore due to the terrible smell. But it has the advantage that it's really cheap and it dries extremely fast. So you can fill a gap and half an hour later you can sand it, which you can't do with all the other ones. So if you're in a hurry, this stuff comes in handy. Okay, now let's get back to filling gaps. If you don't want to glue the parts together, I for example use kitchen foil to separate them. I put the epoxy putty, in this case Aves, on one side of the model and then kitchen foil on the other. With a scalpel I remove the excess or use clay sculpting tools and alcohol to smoothen the surface. After the remodeling I remove the kitchen foil and let the sculpting mask cure. And this is the result after the first round. Then I'm sanding away the excess using the same tools as in step 1, and I constantly test fit the parts. What also works to separate the parts instead of kitchen foil is packaging tape. And I've seen people use masking liquid or even Vaseline, but that's too much of a mess for me. Once the gaps become too small for the epoxy putty, I go in with regular putty, in this case the one from Tamiya. And here you can see how much dust has gathered in the water by now. And if you've seen my video about hollowing your resin prints before printing, here I'm fixing the hole I drilled into the model in the other video with Milliput. After a few rounds of putty, the gaps have been closed. Once the water has become too dirty, I switch buckets by letting the dust sit for a while and then remove that with a paper towel. This way I can basically go on forever, and if I'm at the stage where the water is too dirty, which hasn't happened yet, I let it evaporate in the sun. I wouldn't pour this water with resin residue down the drain, even though it's supposed to be cured resin. From time to time I'm also switching colors that I prime the models with, because you can see imperfections differently with different colors. Black for example brings out a lot. So even though I thought it looks really good unprimed, after painting it black you see new flaws like layer lines or scratches. And to get rid of these small scratches I'm now going in with one layer of spray filler, and after that all the scratches are gone. You gotta be careful with it though, since you also slowly hide details if you overdo it. So I'm not using spray filler for textured areas. But with the small files you can resharpen the hard edges that might be softened by the spray filler. And with that, the model is all smooth and all the seam lines are gone and everything fits together perfectly. Now sometimes you might have gaps with texture that need to be filled. For that you could try to recreate the texture with sculpting tools, like I did here. Or you can make your life easier and achieve a better result with the trick I'm showing you on this Batman torso. I want to do a fabric cape and need to recreate the texture of the suit to fill the keyholes where the original cape would go. How you can do this really quick and easy is to take a bit of baby powder and hot glue to create a mold of the texture. You put the baby powder at the chosen area where you want to copy the texture from, and then you put hot glue on it. The baby powder prevents the hot glue from sticking too much. Once the hot glue has cooled, you can remove it, and now you basically have a flexible stamp that you can use to recreate a texture with an epoxy sculpt. Instead of hot glue, you could also take silicone that just needs longer to cure, but it might give you an even better copy. Or if you have the skill, you could use a 3D modeling program like Blender to extract the texture from the original model and create a stencil that you print together with your model. Then I'm filling the hole with epoxy sculpt and try to recreate the correct shape. Then I'm spritzing on a bit of alcohol to the hot glue so that it won't stick to the epoxy sculpt, and gently give it a push. And now we have copied and pasted a texture and filled the key. For this penguin torso with a long seam line going along this textured vest, this method wouldn't really have worked, so what I did is I simply resculpted and extended his cloak with epoxy sculpt to cover the seam line. And with the backside of my glove, I copied the texture onto the putty. Or on the head here, I used my rotary tool to recreate the hair strands. And with that, I've shown you all the methods, products and tools I'm currently using for the post-processing of resin printed parts. In one of my next videos, I'll show you my tricks for FDM printed parts, and then we move on to priming. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button and stay tuned.